Right. So step 3, choosing a technical design. So this process takes about 4 weeks. And the reason that is because it's a pretty big decision that you have to make as an organization. And it really boils down to 2 different points. There's what we call the all-in approach, which is I want to expand and make our whole corporate infrastructure part of our compliance boundary today. And there's another one called a CUI enclave, meaning I want to carve out the controlled unclassified information I have today and put it either physically or logically separated away from the corporate infrastructure I have running my daily operations. So the question is, how in the world, Sam, do I know which one to pick?
Yeah, we see a huge maybe a mistake that people make by saying enclave is the only way, or it's going to be easier if I do an enclave. And we won't necessarily break all of that down in this webinar, but the blog actually does break down why, all in or lift and shift, as some people call it, or an enclave is the best approach. So I know you get approached all the time.
All the
people
time.
are like, enclave is the only way. And you're like, well, not necessarily.
Not necessarily. And this comes down to these really kind of 3 questions that we're going to talk about. So big acronym, you can see all of their different infrastructure they have today, all the different departments and different operational capacities. And when we look at big acronym, or we look at an environment or a customer that we're talking to, we pose these 3 questions. The first one is, do you know where your CUI is? Sam, how can you build a CUI enclave if you don't know where the CUI is?
You can't.
You can't. So immediately, if you don't have a strong understanding about how the data flows in the organization, that's a problem, right? I can't build a nice little box to put all my CUI in if I don't know where it is. So that first kind of point that we want to make sure to address. And I do want to speak for a minute there. A lot of times when I'm talking to different customers, it's the IT people or maybe even the owner operator that's approaching us, right? Especially from a small business. And it becomes very difficult to task a technical person with the task of identifying all the CUI in an organization, because they might not be the data owner, right? They might be running the platform like your ERP system, but they don't know where all that data is. So this really concerted effort by the whole company in a lot of interviews, honestly, and even a lot of technologies like content search and Office 365 that we also have a blog for published out there. To get to this answer. This is not an easy question to answer, but it's vital to picking the right type of implementation you go with.
Yeah, we see a lot of people asking, hey, how do I even start? And we wrote a blog recently on using Microsoft Purview and Office 365 to identify. So that's a good place to start. But just like the CMMC levels are an aggregate, these steps are an aggregate. Like you can't do 4 without doing 1, 2, and 3.
That's right.
They build on top of each other, right? So identifying the data and the data flow is huge.
Huge. Very, very, very important. And honestly, very commonly overlooked.
Yeah.
Next up is who actually needs access to this data, right? If I'm looking to build an enclave, but maybe 50% of my staff needs access to that data day in and day out, it might not make sense to run 2 environments, right? It might actually inhibit their job performance. You might see that degraded performance from your employees because they're having to jump in and out of an enclave or an isolated environment where this data is going to be held. And this is another question we get a lot, right? How do we enable collaboration? Well, the easiest way to enable collaboration is have everybody on the same environment talking the same language, right? Segmenting out just certain business lines or certain particular types of data like CUI just make it more difficult to collaborate day in and day out. And the last one is what's going to be easier to manage and, more importantly, for small businesses, more cost effective. So again, we have this conversation a lot. Enclaves are great. Big fan of enclaves. We actually did a talk about it at CS2 in DC that we have a recording for on our YouTube. But it's just very difficult for a small business to operate 2 environments. And it's one of those things that, as you know, Sam, small businesses want to spend their money wisely, right? And we want to make sure that we're pointing small businesses to picking the right thing here. And operating a single environment is significantly more cost effective than splitting the environment in 2. Just how it works, right? One IT person running 2 different sets of infrastructure, or one managed services running 2 different sets of infrastructure, it just doesn't scale well.
Yeah. And by the looks of that headshot from the big acronym president, you can see they're big on cost. That blazer he was sporting was not cheap. Right.
That's right.
So Enclave or Blazers is really the question for big acronym.
That's really what you got to decide.
Yeah.
And in this case, I think we're probably going to go with the Blazers.
Let's do it.
All right. So next up, after I get this to work here, this is a fun question to answer. So not only do we not know where our CUI is, who needs access to it, and what's going to be the easiest and most cost-effective to manage, we're going to start actually looking at vetting the cloud providers that are going to have that information on it, right? So this is going to be a big deciding point on where do I go, right? If I'm moving in the direction of all in, which is where we're moving for the simplicity of big acronym here, I need to vet and make sure that everything checks the box. So one of the questions we get a lot is, what is compliant? What cloud platform can I use that has CUI in it? It's a very good question. And here are some questions to ask your cloud provider today. So the very first one, are they FedRAMP moderate or moderate equivalent? And so if they're moderate equivalent, which is a very kind of, what's the best way to say this, Sam? Very loose term potentially.
Or tense.
Or tense term
could say
sometimes. So really what this means is they need to be able to show a body of evidence that a 3PAO or a FedRAMP assessor took them through, right? So they either are FedRAMP authorized, which you can see the link here on the screen to check them out, or they need to be able to produce the appropriate evidence to show that they went through an assessment for FedRAMP or for NIST 853. And if they can't, we're immediately down to, you got to migrate somewhere else. You got to move that data somewhere else. Next up is, do they meet the cyber incident or incident response requirements of DFAR 7012?
Paragraph C through G.
C through G. And as we talked about before, big acronym, we're looking CMMC level 2, right? We have DFAR 7012 clauses existing today for the work that we do. We want to make sure that we keep that type of business. So if the cloud provider cannot support that, Sam, what do we got to do?
Well, I actually, to change the subject a little bit,
Okay.
I saw a question come in here about, can I use GCC to meet 7012?
Ooh, good
Or
question.
do I have to meet GCC? Do I have to use GCC high to meet 7012 CMMC? We have a blog, and step 3 actually goes in depth about those two things. So short answer, yes, you can actually use Microsoft 365 GCC to meet the reporting requirements. Is it the best platform for your long-term strategy?
Maybe not.
That's a different question. So we won't spend too much time on that, but I really wanted to answer that question because it's a common one that I know you get all the time. They're like, I have to use GCCI, and it's, well, you don't have to, but let me tell you why it's a good idea, right? So again, we'll link resources in the chat, but right, if they can't meet C through G, you got to go to a different platform.
That's right.
And we have a lot of resources on this. If you want to go to the next, these questions are compounding, right? So FedRAMP or FedRAMP moderate or equivalent, C through G, and then ITAR.
Yep. So the very last one is, if I have export control requirements right around the data that I'm receiving, then does my cloud provider support that? Right? Export control, ITAR. I mean, do they? And if not, guess what? We got to move to a different platform, right? So when you're going through this process, it's very important to interview. And honestly, it's a lot of work. When I first started at Summit 7, one of my tasks was to vet a ton of different cloud providers for what type of requirements they met today. And you said the word FedRAMP, and they looked at you like, what is that, right? What is FedRAMP? This was several years ago. Or what is DFARS? Or what is CUI? Or what is export control? You know, they didn't understand the requirements, and a lot of cloud providers still don't.
Yeah.
And that's really what makes it kind of difficult, right? Is you're going to pose these questions and you're going to get crickets, right? And so if you get crickets, chances are they're probably not going to be a good fit, or they're going to have you have to do some kind of plug-in or some kind of, you know, additional, what's the best way to say this? Yeah, plug-in, a third-party adapter of some sort to be able to transmit that successfully, right? And so we want to make sure that we're going to point people to a very simple and very native platform that users don't have to jump through 12 hoops to send data.
Right. And Big Acronym's president actually has been going to Egypt a lot, and they're trying to get a little international work going on. They're not there yet. So, but the problem is, if they're going to have ITAR in the future, then maybe if they choose something now, they might have to migrate to a different platform if they then have ITAR in new contracts, right? 6 months, 12 months, 2 years down the road. And you're talking about doing an entire migration again.
Yep.
So it's really a cost benefit analysis. And what are you going to go after in the long term?
That's right.
Yeah.
Absolutely. So if they happen to meet all these requirements and you have all these requirements, if you do, then you win. You get to keep using them as a cloud provider, which is what we're looking for, right?
Sure.
We want to find a solution where we don't have to do 2 or 3 kind of hops along the way. So we're going to talk about, again, the different CMMC levels and how they relate to the actual Microsoft cloud, right? We're Microsoft partners. We are in this environment all the time. We have hundreds of customers that we support in this. And this is going to answer a lot of the questions that you had, Sam.
Yep.
So the first one is CMMC level 1. Where do I need to be CMMC level 1? Good news, guess what? You can do it in commercial today. We actually have a CMMC level 1 engagement.
That's
we
right.
wrote the CMMC level 1 architecture guide that Microsoft uses. That's on our blog as well, I believe, right? cmmc.blog.
Yep. And that's with an E3 license.
That's with an M365 E3 license. That's right.
Yep.
The problem is doesn't support big acronym. You know why? No DFAR 7012 clause. So let's move on to the next cloud. And to what Sam was saying, there are 2 gov clouds that Microsoft has, right? So there's the GCC cloud and there's the commercial cloud, right? Or GCC High. So this middle one that we're on is the GCC, the Government Community Cloud. And the back end of that is Azure Commercial. And what does that support? That supports DFAR 7012, but it supports DFAR 7012 for basic CUI requirements. Sam, I get this question a lot. Basic CUI. What is it? How do I know where it is? But more importantly, is there something more than basic CUI?
Yes. There's a thing called specified CUI.
Okay.
You want to talk about it?
Maybe I do.
Okay.
So specified CUI is really where this last environment comes into play from the Microsoft side of the house, right? So DFAR 7012 is basic CUI, meaning it needs to meet and the data NIST 800-171, right? All the security controls and the FedRAMP and all that great stuff. But if I have export control data, which is a form of specified CUI, then I need to go to the highest gov cloud. And the main reason that is because I need to make sure that that data stays in the United States per the requirements and be accessed by US citizens. And so if you're looking at this chart and you either have this requirement today, which big acronym does, or you're anticipating going after work or receiving work that has this requirement, it is very, very important to make the right decision now, which you see that represented here on the next screen. Right. So CMMC levels 2 through 3 meet future business requirements, compliance requirements, again, coming out middle of next year. Right. So very short timeline there. GCC High and Azure Government, you should really start there. If you know you're going to have the need in the future for export control data, it's best not to have to do 2 implementations and 2 migrations into a platform. Honest, users don't like that.
Right.
They don't like the classic who moved my cheese, right? They don't want their device to have to be enrolled and re-enrolled multiple times over the course of 1 or 2 or 3 years, right? We want to go to our final destination, right? The desired outcome is to be compliant as possible and to take on as much business as possible, right?
Yeah, and we'll put a link to this in the chat. We actually wrote a guide to CMMC level 2 recently, and it's NIST 800-171. Those are the technical requirements, but that guide we'll put in the chat will really help you extrapolate, okay, what do I need to do and where am I?
Great. All right. So for this case, for big acronym, we're going to go the all-in approach, right? We're going to have a simple environment to manage. We're going to bring all the different assets under scope and under purview of CMMC level 2. And we're going to make sure that all users have the appropriate level of access to make sure that we're maximizing productivity in this environment.